Hello everybody, welcome to Drawing Together. I'm Scott, this is Artist Network. Our Drawing Together session for Monday, it feels like it's been a really long time, so I am very excited to be here working on this landscape drawing today. Thinking about the mountains here in Colorado and how so many of them are on fire. We get to work on this one today where it feels a little bit more refreshing. So we're going to dig right into it. I'm just checking the chat here to see if there are any questions. If you are new, you're going to want to know that you can find the reference photo in the description below. I've also, we've made a change a bit. So if you look in the description now, there's a link directly to the episode page on Artist Network where you can share your work. And it should be all set up for you to share your work. I saw a lot come in over the weekend, a lot of really great drawings. So thank you for sharing those. So let's try to use that page. It's a great place for us all to connect and see what everybody's working on. So that link is in the description below, as well as, again, as the reference image. So I have the reference image up. This is what we're working on today. This is a little bit different in that I'm working on this gray toned paper. So throughout the series, when I've worked on toned paper, it's been a tan toned. This is a gray toned. I really enjoy working on it. It is this Strathmore gray toned, really easy to find generally. And so works out well. Trying a few new things as well. For my eraser selection today, let me set that aside now. My eraser selection, I have my kneaded eraser. I have my rubber eraser that I took a razor blade to kind of sharpen up some of the edges and kind of clean it off a bit. And then I have this Tombow plastic eraser that I found worked really well for the preparatory drawing. So, but it's relatively new. So I'm just kind of playing around with the difference between a rubber and a plastic eraser. I am also working, since we have this toned paper, we're going to have to build the lights using a white chalk pencil. I've got a General's chalk pencil here. I've got my kind of workhorse, my Ebony Pencil, that's going to be building a lot of the middle values. Of course, we're starting with a gray, so building from the middle values to slightly darker. And then I have my Creatacolor black pencil as well. So I have a really full range of values when I have the white chalk, the black Creatacolor pencil. If you have a black colored pencil, a carbon pencil, I think works out really well. I know I believe General's makes a black drawing pencil as well. Lyra makes great pencils. So there's a lot of different brands that make a very dark drawing material. So that's what I'm using here. I also have my shading stumps, but this time I learned in the preparatory sketch that I need to have an additional shading stump. So this will be for my lights, my whites, and then I have my old one for some of the darker areas. So let's get started. Actually, let me pull this back up and kind of talk through the direction we're going with this, because I really like this one, not just for the subject matter. I'm a landscape painter. This is typically what I would choose to paint. But beyond that, there's something in the process that I found really eye-opening. And in that, again, we're starting with a toned paper, we're pushing towards the lights, and we're building the blacks. But there's something in this subject in which the presence of the lights, the substance of the light areas is kind of a key factor in this. And so I learned a lot about value control and also about how to play around with edges and the pressure of the material to create a sense of substance in those light areas so it doesn't feel like just blankness. And then in particular paying attention to the soft edges here that create the mist, and some of these harder edges that suggest the snow on those mountains. So I found like once I got into this, there was a lot more to sink my teeth into than I had initially intended or anticipated. So the joy, you're asking a question about prepping the page. So if you only have white paper and you're building up all the values, should you prep it with graphite? My first inclination is to say yes. Because then erasing out those lights is, in a negative drawing way, is a way to help to create more of a presence there. Now, but the one thing I caution about that though is maybe do a test on a separate piece of that same paper to make sure you can erase back down to generally a bright white. So there may be some areas where you want to kind of keep it loose and atmospheric and leave it a little bit softer. So if you're starting on a white paper, what you might do is tone the whole page, but maybe leave the center area lighter than the rest, and kind of play around with that. So maybe not an even tone of graphite, if that makes sense. Okay. So we'll dig right into it. I'm not seeing any other questions, but if you do, feel free to call them out in all caps. I see them a little bit easier. If you're new and you're wondering why people are yelling, they're not. They're just asking questions. I am open to any observations throughout this entire process. Edges, again, are really important in a landscape drawing. And one of the things that is kind of substantively different than most other subjects we've tackled is that in a landscape, you're drawing the whole thing. It's the space that becomes the subject, not just an object on the page. It is helpful to establish a kind of a focal point and understand for you what the focal point might be. But for me, what's really kind of important is to realize that we're drawing that environment. And it is a little bit different than when you have a singular object. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to start by just kind of toning the bottom page. If you squint your eyes at the subject, you're going to see a general gradation of value where it's light at the top and darker at the bottom. And one of the challenges in drawing a landscape is interpreting color as value. And it's one of the reasons why I use a colored photograph to work from. And in fact, in this one, this is a stock photo that I found, and I intentionally boosted the color for this in some of those areas. So some of those orange in the tundra below there, that is a little bit boosted. And what can sometimes happen, what I play around a lot with in a landscape painting is towards the foreground, dropping the value but increasing the saturation, because when you increase the saturation, it can sometimes create the impression of a lighter value than it actually is. So when we're working with landscape values, we can sometimes have to push something darker than it may feel. So when I look at the subject and I see those bright oranges down in this lower area, my inclination is to make those lighter and brighter, but I actually need to drop the values. And so a lot of what we're going to be dealing with in this is managing the contrast as we drop down. So increasing the intervals between the values, but dropping them down in here. And I'll kind of explain that a little bit more later. I want to start suggesting some of the key features in the landscape, and one of the landmarks is going to be this hillside here. The mist is right behind it, and then we have this hill come out, and then it kind of rolls down, and we have the river that cuts across diagonally. So I need to figure out where that river is going to be, and we're just kind of sneak up on some of these things. If you squint your eyes, a lot of it gets lost, and that's helpful at this stage, just to try to squint your eyes. But right now there's this general hillside here, then it gets a little steeper in this hill, this mountain kind of slopes off over here, and what I like about this is there's this overlapping of the land formations here. They kind of interlock, and that is really helpful in creating that depth. That overlapping of forms is a great way to create depth, and so I want to be paying attention to that. Right now though, I just want to be thinking about some of the major features. So right now, if I place that hillside here, it's a little, it's higher than midway by a noticeable amount. So I want to compare that to the reference photo. So I'm closing one eye, using my pencil to gauge that bottom distance, and it's about right. Okay, so I've generally at about the right spot, and this intersection point where we have this more gentle slope up this way, and then you have a more steeper angle, it makes this intersection point right here. And it is just off to the right from center. And I have it off to the left, so I need to push things a little bit more. I'm not trying to get bogged down in any of the details, and it's really kind of important that you don't get sucked into any of the specific formations at this point. Scale, it gets really tricky to manage in a landscape because our concentration, where our mind goes when we're looking at these formations. If I'm looking at this mountain back in here, this hill before the big ones, it feels really large. When I focus on it, everything else fades away and it takes up a greater presence in my mind, and there's a tendency to make it larger than it actually is. And so that's why it's really important in a landscape to think holistically about the scene, and try to get the general proportions correct before you get into those details. So I'm just drawing some of the key features in this area. Now, looking at these values, I'm gonna drop the values down a little bit more in this area. So I'm adding just a light haze. I'm keeping this all open because this is all going to be light. And I'm anticipating up in this section, there's this ridge line where most of that mountain is actually going to be the gray of the paper. So again, I want to sneak up on those values a little bit. But right now, I need to kind of establish the basic scale of the landscape so that I know that everything's going to fit the way it needs to on the page. And as I'm doing that, I'm starting to anticipate these turns in the river. We're going to talk about the perspective of the river as we go through. It's an area that I see in some landscape painters. You know, if you're new, there's a tendency to create these rivers that are tilted. And so we want to address that in this as well. Make sure everything feels relatively flat on that, and on the plane, the ground plane there. So I'm looking for kind of landmarks, and in the river, the bends are really the landmarks, and I'm looking at them in relation to this hill that I've created over here. So you haven't done any of the drawing here, none of the subtle variations and the bumps and the curves in the landscape there. I'm just getting that overall shape. I'm dropping a value on there so I can see it, but I'm just getting a sense for where that river might be so that it doesn't come back to bite me later if I haven't planned for it. But I don't want to start rendering it. I just want to be thinking through it. This is the kind of the rough gesture. It's getting information on the page, and now then we have something to react to. This can get a little bit more steep here. And I just have this general line here. We're going to make that more specific as we go. Looking for the slope of this hillside over here and some of those landmarks. And you can see I'm just using the side of the pencil, so I'm not really drawing anything in an outline. I'm just kind of trying to block in some of these. I can move up here. This is a little bit darker over here. And one of the things I loved about this reference photo is this crevasse that holds a bit of snow in there along this edge. So it creates this nice flow where we have an angle that moves us down here across. We have this up here that brings us up and around, and we have the mountain mist that we kind of gently come down and we flow through that composition. But there's a little bit more visibility to this mountaintop here. So I can add a little bit of value, but I want to be careful. It's mostly the gray of the paper. So a rough block in. Paul said, yeah, I'm sitting down today. It was kind of a spur of the moment decision. I've been standing for the last one to see if that helps, the last few to see if that helps my shoulder. Doing some work on that. Just doing all of this drawing has been a little challenging on my neck and this shoulder here. So we're seated today. Okay, so as I work in this area, there's going to be a lot of negative drawing, and this is where it's going to be a little uncomfortable for some of you that may not have worked with a white material. So you know what I liked about this is that we're thinking very additively down here and very subtractively here in a way, and so our brain has to confront those two processes. So here, when I'm laying the white down, I'm trying to interpret what it. I'm trying to interpret the negative space and see what it does in terms of referring to the mountain itself. And what I love out here is how that mountain just falls into the mist. So I can start to just block this whole area in. And just like with the graphite, we're building kind of slowly with the chalk, sneaking up on the values, but on the high end of the value range, going towards the light. I know it's light here, but I've got this hillside. I want to interpret the angle. Kind of lightly suggest that. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm trying to imagine if I continue that line down, where does it intersect this hill? And that seems about right compared to the reference photo. Okay. Giving myself a little bit of a suggestion of that hillscape. And then up here, we can see some of that distant mountain showing through. And you see these darker patches. And I want to make sure that I get the scale right. So I'm going to refer to this landmark here. And I can feel my brain kind of freaking out a little bit right now as I'm laying in the lights, because my instinct is to go to draw the dark parts of that mountain, but I'm actually drawing the snow up in that area right now. And I'm using the side of the pencil. I don't want a lot of detail. I want the tooth of the paper to help suggest some of that texture in there. So much of my landscape work is utilizing the material in such a way that you suggest the texture. So kind of scumbling and scraping across the surface rather than using a very fine brush. So I can start to see some of those mountain formations, and I can use my eraser to actually draw some of that in. This gets light here, so I'm going to start to soften this area here. This is now atmosphere. Let me see what happens if I use my shading stump to kind of fill this in. See, it drops the value down, but it's filling in some of the tooth of the paper. One of the things I noticed with the chalk is that it's so easy to break the tip of the chalk off. So I'm trying to be a little gentle. I might need to support it with this finger a bit. So, and then this all just kind of transitions into light. You can see it's breaking off into these chunks here, so I'm actually just gonna, I've got it on my fingertip here and I'm not gonna waste it. I'm just gonna kind of fill that in. I may end up having to sharpen this as I go. Let's see. So as I'm doing this, I'm also rolling the pencil, the chalk pencil in my fingers to keep that round. And then here, this mountain just kind of diffuses. H.A. Arts asking, how long is this going to take? Typically, our drawings in this series, they take an hour and a half to 2 hours or so. Some of them have been a little bit shorter. I imagine that this is going to take closer to an hour and a half for this drawing. So just building up values. Now, I need to be aware of where some of the formations are. So this area gets really soft and atmospheric. So I'm going to kind of confront it in both directions here. Sorry, this is just getting a little distracting here, that texture. I'm going to build up layers of that chalk. If you have a pastel pencil, it also works out well. One of the things I learned in doing the preparatory drawing is that I I waited till later in the drawing to actually add the lights, and that kind of came back to bite me because I had allowed some of the graphite to kind of work its way up there, and I didn't see it. I didn't clean it off. I didn't clean off the paper very well, and it made the chalk a bit muddy. So that's why I'm attacking it a little bit earlier in the process than I did in the preparatory one. Just trying to learn from that lesson. So doing some negative drawing. My mind is on the shape of the mountain up here. I want to get a sense for that distance. So, because I feel like the scale is off a bit. Something's a little wrong here. I think this just needs to be smaller. So I'm looking at that kind of point there on the mountain ridge, just gauge that distance. And that feels a little bit better. So I just brought that in just a touch. And there's not quite as much of the sky showing here, but I think that's okay. Yeah, if you have white paper, the white chalk's not going to show up at all on yours. So you might have to do a purely additive drawing for this one. So there's this drop in here. So what I want to be careful with is creating a line that's too strong. So again, what I'm doing is I'm actually going to render this a little bit more. I'm looking for that path that mountain ridge is taking. I'm just kind of tapping along it so I don't have too hard of a line, but it allows me to start to visualize what that path might be. And then what I can do is I can fill this kind of in. I just want to be careful with the direction of my marks. Make sure that it doesn't become too distracting. So we're going to actually have to build up more layers of the chalk for this. We're going to smooth it out. I can see dust just building up on that, which is awesome. Changing up the direction of my marks. And as I get over here where it's very soft, I'm going to change my marks mostly to kind of a circular motion, because it's going to lend itself to the atmosphere. If I make my marks too directional, it could be challenging. All right, so I think this is working out all right. I need to build up more light here though, and start to transition. And now I can see the mountain through here. So as I start to add the white here, it needs to suggest the snow on the mountainside. So I need to be mindful of that. So I'm just keeping the pressure a little bit light here. Shouldn't be using my fingertips, and I'm doing it anyways. I'm just I'm just acknowledging the fact that I'm doing something bad right now. And but you know, if you're wondering, generally you don't use your fingertips because they're oily. They can interfere with the drawing materials. It'd be bad for the paper. And I'm doing that because I want to. It's just a choice I'm making today. Why not? It's one of the things about materials that I love is I love interacting with the materials. I have a real hard time drawing or painting with gloves, but I should, because it's not healthy for me. Drawing materials is less of a concern, but you do want to be careful, especially with anything that has pigments in it. All right, so I'm building up some building up some of that atmosphere. I'm going to bring that down here. It doesn't really smudge as easily as graphite or charcoal. So I'm going to start to suggest some of the mist that comes over, and this is where really edges are going to be a key thing, key factor in this drawing. So I'm going to use the shading stump. And really paying attention to where the edges are harder and more visible, where they're softer, more diffused. Building up some of the value here. Now, as I'm working through this area, I'm blocking it in, but I'm also paying attention to some of the subtle variations because I'm trying to anticipate what I'm going to do in this area to provide some structure to that mountainside. And I can see subtle variations in value. Pick up more chalk here, kind of loading it onto the shading stump. And one of the reasons I started my initial study, kind of backwards, where I kind of came to the sky towards the end, is that this is the gold. This is where my mind is really drawn to. And in general, I like to save those for the end. But I feel like ultimately it serves the drawing better to hit this in the beginning. Brogan Pittman, thank you for those comments. Yeah, so if you have any questions about the material, they're in the description below. Thank you for calling that out, Sandy. Oh, Marilyn, I'm glad that comment. All right, Brogan, whatever. Okay, it just cracks me up. But if you have any questions about the materials, they are in the description below. But yeah, basically for this one, I'm using an ebony pencil for the most part, and then with this white chalk, and then we have a black drawing pencil that we're going to come in to help fill out that value range. All right, so I'm going to come across to this area here, and I want to start to provide some more structure to this area. And so as we kind of created this atmosphere here, some of the softer edges, I can start to see some of the more kind of detailed elements of that mountainside. And before I do that, I want to kind of take stock of where I am in the in the drawing. Where am I in relation to some of the other key elements? And since this becomes a landmark, this hill, I'm going to look up from there and locate some of these other kind of snow fields there. Now, what I found is kind of easier for representing these areas is to kind of practice in your mind before you make the mark what direction you need to go in, and utilizing the side of the pencil, rolling it and allowing those marks to be more organic, I found it creates the suggestion of that texture and the structure a bit more effectively than switching to this tripod grip and filling in these spots. So some of these marks may not match one-to-one with the reference photo, but it's going to read more naturalistically. It's going to feel more natural. So I want to, but as I'm making my marks, I'm also thinking about where I am relative to other forms so that I'm getting the scale correct. and looking at some of these, because I feel like what I've done, I feel like I've pushed this up too high. And I think what I need to do is actually come down a little bit. This is the part when in scale in landscapes is really tricky, because your brain says, all right, this is a giant mountain, you know, we want to make it big, but because it's farther out, it's farther away, it's smaller. It's taking up a smaller portion of our field of vision than you know, than we might actually realize, if that makes sense. So just kind of putting that into check a little bit. So this is just taking a little bit more concentration, but I'm going to try to describe what's happening. And now I've overstated some of it. There's some areas where I think I want to show some of the darker texture of the mountain. I'm going to show you how we're going to address that though. Mountain Sun is asking a bit about the papers. Let me pull that up a little bit again. So this is a Strathmore toned gray. So this is 80 pounds. So it's pretty lightweight actually, but it works really well, I think, for this material. Jessica is asking about the difference between an easel and a tabletop. I prefer an easel as well. It's more of a challenge for filming to be able to get squared up over the image. Just the nature of orienting the cameras is all. So then I'm working on the tabletop, but if I had my way, I would actually prefer to work on an easel. So again, my brain is a little weirded out by the process here, laying down these marks, but I'm actually creating light and trying to look at that negative space for it to be mountain, because then eventually as I start making marks, that'll actually be positive space that I'll be drawing. So hopefully if you're following along and you have the white pencil on the gray paper, it's working out for you. And then Judy is asking, if painting this for Misty Mountains, what would be your canvas background color? Stay white? So Judy, what I tend to do, you know, you'll see a lot of painters kind of tone the whole ground. I've been practicing not necessarily toning the whole ground, the whole surface before I paint, but rather toning the land and leaving the sky the white of the canvas. And I've been finding that that's been working out well. So I might leave this area white and then do a value kind of ground here with a burnt umber blue, like a ultramarine blue type of combination. I don't use ultramarine blue, but I might do that kind of a blue, gray, umber kind of tone for the ground to establish those. And then I just like what that does in terms of the luminosity of the sky, leaving it white, because then I can be a bit more transparent with my colors, and it creates some interesting effects that way. So that's just something that's something that I've started kind of doing recently, and I found it's been helpful. Okay, so I'm kind of building up these areas. I feel like I need more kind of substance in the mist here. So I'm going to bring down some of this down here. And if I lay down too much, I can always lift it off with the eraser. I'm actually going to define this edge here. Again, kind of doing some negative drawing. And I'm trying to pay attention to my edges here because this is where that softness is going to be really important. And I'm laying down too much. I'm losing some of the subtle forms and shifts in value in here, but I'm actually going to come in with the eraser to kind of clarify that a little bit more. And then there's this one little kind of cool crevice right there. I think I overstated it, but it works out all right. Really filed this guy down. Look at that. It's almost done. I'll have to sharpen that a bit. Okay, soften that up. So we're starting to see that natural gradation form. Again, as I talked about, if you kind of squint at the reference photo, you can see a general gradation where it gets relatively dark down towards the edge. And that's starting to form. But yeah, as we work in these distant areas, keep your scale in check because it's so easy to make this larger than it actually is. Just kind of rolling the pencil to kind of suggest some of that texture, as I don't want that to be too linear. And then really paying attention to this edge. I'm trying to identify where along this edge it becomes more visible. So like if in here, for example, I think I've softened it too much. Well, I'm going to exaggerate that a little bit and really bring in more atmosphere here and kind of show you what I'm talking about. Bringing in some of that mist. And then if you just use your eraser, now this gets it plays into your mind being messed with a little bit here, in that I want to create darks by actually lifting off the material from the paper. That's why I think it's really helpful to practice drawing on toned paper. So I'm looking for the edge of that mountain. Using the eraser, I need a sharper edge. And then this is where I can look for some of the dark areas in the reference photo and kind of lift those off with the eraser to suggest some of that mountain structure back in there. So I'm looking for where it's darker, and that's where I'm actually going to be pressing down and lifting out some more of the material. And I'm looking up at the screen right now that shows what's happening on the camera, and it's the equivalent of taking this and holding it up vertically, so I can check the perspective and check the proportions and see how everything is landing, because I'm having a harder time evaluating the work at this angle here. So I think it's good and healthy for you to kind of set your easel or your drawing board up, your paper, look at it from a distance. Now, like in this stretch along in here, I'm thinking about the structure of the landscape. Again, looking for areas that are darker. I'm going to pull that up with the eraser. And again, that's where it can be a little weird for the brain. All right, so I'm going to bring up this one that's got a little bit more life to it. Just looking at the way the light falls in this area here. And these bands of light. Just using the weight of the material, and where I need to, if I've found the path that I want to be on, then I'll push down a little bit more. And here it gets a little bit softer, but then the edge gets more sharp along in here. That's where I'm going to bear down a little bit more, feather it out a little bit. Yes, Tricia is saying the blending stump helps with the white charcoal. It does, and it's so funny because I was just thinking in my mind, I need to pull that up when I look up and see your very timely comment. Okay, so we're going to add a little bit more structure. I'm going to come back to this area, I think, a little bit more later, but I want to move forward in the rest of the drawing. I'm feeling pretty confident about that being pushed back. Now we want to pull the mountain forward. So this is where I'm going to come in here and look for the shape of some of these darker areas. But I'm just using the weight of the pencil. I want to be careful because I want to preserve my darkest darks for down in here. Since I have that light next to it, creating some additional context, I can be really subtle with some of these values, and it's going to stand out pretty well. Sharpen up some of the edges so I can come in here with the sharper point, kind of refine that jagged edge. But I want to be really, really sensitive to that because I don't want to overstate it and bring that forward. And then there's some areas in here where I might actually be able to drop the value a little bit, draw some of these darker areas. So a lot of what I'm doing in this section here is really more tapping the pencil on there, tapping and scraping, and letting the tooth of the paper play a role in all of this so that it suggests the texture. There's a question saying about what do you do to substitute if you don't have the white chalk? Then it's hard to really substitute that. I mean, a lot of what this lesson is about is switching back and forth between the additive and subtractive process. But in this case, if there was tone on the paper, if you built up on the white paper some graphite, then you're using your eraser to kind of pull out some of those areas. And so as I'm going through, this is one of the things I talk about a lot about throughout the process, is when I'm looking at the reference photo up here, I'm looking to establish the direction, the size, the scale of the marks that I make. When I'm looking at the paper, I'm really evaluating, where am I? Am I in the right spot? And then just simply trying to execute on the marks that I have in my mind kind of playing out when I'm looking at the reference photo. So just using the side of the pencil, actually there's a lot of weight being put on my wrist here, and you can see how dirty my fingers are. They're just kind of scraping on the surface, and that allows me to just kind of tap when I need it, apply pressure when I need it, just kind of scrape across the surface and allow the tooth of the paper to do its thing without getting in there and needing to control every little mark using the point of the pencil. Because if I were in the landscape, and this is a large part of what this whole series is about, is being indoors, but practicing for being outdoors and reacting to the landscape on plein air. And if I was on location, if this was a preparatory sketch for a painting, for example, I wouldn't have a whole lot of time to be able to render. And I'd need to be able to suggest and block in forms quickly. So I'm working over here. I'm seeing the change in plane. So we drop down. There's an angle we're almost looking directly at here, and it makes a turn, and then it crosses this ground plane that slants away. So the marks here get really shallow. I'm looking to find that ridge line along here where that turn takes place, and then try to adjust the direction of my marks to suggest those two different planes. One of the things you also want to be mindful of is that we have a tendency in our minds to make regularly spaced even marks, looking for patterns like that. But those patterns don't often exist in nature. So as I'm looking up here, I see these areas, these thin dark spots over in this area, and it's so easy to make almost tiger stripes across there. So I want to be mindful not to do that. Think about the flow of the landscape. You know, a lot of it is kind of visualizing almost visualizing the land is there, and I'm just allowing my pencil to move over that landscape, that structure. So whereas up here when I was rendering the darker marks by using the eraser, now I'm making the darker areas using the graphite here, the ebony pencil, and it's kind of messing with my mind a little bit. I'm working my way, and I'm in essence working from the background forward. So there's this hill here that's in front of this, it's in front of this, so I need to start drawing some of these hills here. There's a lot to work out in this area because you have these overlapping land formations, and then those land formations themselves seem to have varying kind of geological features. It gets really tricky to try to figure out where are we. So you want to ask yourself, you know, what you need to do here. You know, whether it's something that you want to really kind of bear down and figure out. Or can you kind of suggest and trust just observing the abstract shapes of light and dark in this area? I think for me, and just in you know, just with keeping mind of the time that we're all here, I'm just looking at these as shapes of light and dark and not really trying to figure out what's happening with the structure of the landscape. With a painting, if I were to get in here with a painting, I might spend a bit more time in that, but for this initial kind of study or sketch, I think I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Just kind of look for the patterns of light and dark and trust that if I get generally the right placement, generally the right size, it's going to suggest the structure of the hillside. But you want to evaluate that. So if I look here, it's an abstract mess. Is it distracting? Maybe. And if it is, then I need to address it. Kind of sharpening up this edge along in here because that becomes a focal point. And in particular, with it being largely in the center and right next to this area of mist, I think having that sharp edge is going to be really helpful in making this about that mountain mist. Now the texture of the paper is going to be a big thing, so I'm going to use the tooth of the paper to bring this texture forward. So I'm actually going to go through and start to smooth out some of this landscape here. Sally is saying, again, blurry with the chamois, and then using a kneaded eraser lets me mimic the white chalk. That's awesome. I'm glad you shared that for those of you who are working with just white paper. And drop in some of the value here now. So let me see what happens if I pull up my shading stump. This is my old one now, not the one that I used for the white chalk. Remember, the shading stump, the blending stump isn't just about removing the tooth of the paper. I mean, it's doing that, but this is an opportunity to refine the form. So you're always contributing to the form, the structure, the space. And so I'm trying to also drop in marks as well and correct things. So this is just as much a drawing tool as the ebony pencil, as the white chalk. So I want to be thinking about structure, shape, the direction of the marks, and ask myself how it's contributing to the form of the landscape. One of the challenging things in this is that there's no real directional light source. One of the things I typically look for in a landscape is more of a division between light and dark. That's why painting midday can be a challenge, because it washes everything out, whereas like the golden hour, early in the morning, late at night, or late in the evening, you get these strong shadows that create clear differentiation of space on the page. We don't really have that here. So using the direction of the marks to break up these different regions can be really helpful. So thinking about the slope of each of these mountainous areas, and then using your shading stump to reinforce that. And I'm rolling the material, I'm rolling the shading stump in my fingers. It's picking up more graphite, it's laying it down, just kind of running out in some areas. There's a shadow right in here that I really like. It's small, but I love that angle right there. It helps provide structure to that side that's otherwise pretty washed out. So I want to give that a little bit more love. So most of this is just the gray of the paper, but it's starting to take form. It's starting to feel like it's got mass and substance to it. And I'm kind of working both sides of the paper so I don't get fixated on one area too much. And then I'm going to come back in and lay in some of the light snow fields in here. Just checking any other questions. Looks like we're good for that. So how's everybody doing? I hope you are all joining in from safe places. I know there's just so many fires burning out here in the West. It's sad to see. Here in Colorado, we're managing the smoke of some big fires in the area. All right, so this contrast here will help me with the texture in the ground. So what I'm looking now is I'm looking for the general shape and structure, and I feel like I'm able to see the structure of the landscape throughout here. And one of the things that's also something that happens a lot in the landscape painting I do is like finding just the right places to add a detail or a refined area can be sufficient for bringing a whole area to life. So right now this is pretty, I don't know, it's pretty flat. Not a lot going on there. So my hope is that when I drop in some of the snow in this area, it's going to make it just come to life. And what that is your brain kind of filling in the missing details. If you give it just enough, it's like the brain can run with it. And all of a sudden the whole thing kind of fills in. Ah. I broke my pencil. All right, so now I've got this lead here that I'll just use. I don't need the wood part. And I want to be careful not to make this one kind of solid line as I drop this in. So I'm rolling it in my fingers, kind of using the zigzaggy motion to kind of break up that edge. And then hopefully it'll feel more naturalistic, more like it's a landform than a line. Sally's asking how the cat is. Cat is great. That was Tybalt, who wanted to join us, and he's doing wonderfully. Thank you for asking. Oh, right up in here, I want to bring a little bit more of that mountain. This is when, if we were painting this, digging into these subtle color variations would be really fascinating. Now, the thing is like, there's just really nothing like being on location and to be able to see, the color. The camera makes certain decisions for us that, I think it'd be really helpful to work from a photograph like we're doing now. But man, there's nothing like being out there and really understanding the way the color shifts in a landscape. Okay. What I don't like right now are those two forms right there. They're too similar to one another. That's right, because this needs to be broken up. That feels a bit better now. Okay. It's a little thing, but sometimes those little things can go a long way. So because the pencil broke, I'm drawing with this fine kind of little piece, little stubbins. Okay. Asking what kind of white pencil. I'm using this General's pastel chalk generally. That's what I've used for most of this, and that works out really well for me. This one is actually a little bit different. I can't remember what this is because I have used so much of it. So, all right, moving on to this area. I want to refine this kind of hillside here. So just using the kind of the point of the pencil, I'm trying to keep the side of the pencil engaged as much as possible. I want to be mindful about that edge. I don't want to draw a solid line along there. But I do want to refine that edge. So I'm working on this, and I can start to see that river creeping through here, and the river is a little bit darker in value than this hillside. So what I might do is actually draw that river in. I'm going to overstate it, and then I'm going to cut this area back out with the eraser. And it gets really tricky to see the shift in value here between the water and the landscape. It gets so similar. So I need to resolve that somehow. And then let's see. Let me try this plastic eraser here. Drawing this. It's a little flat spot along in there that I think is important for creating this space back in here. So just be mindful of your edges. If you're using a line to define an edge, just be careful that it's not a solid, consistent line, because you don't want that to flatten out your drawing. I'm going to come back in here and suggest some of these forms here. So I'm rolling the pencil. It's kind of working across the hillside. trying to create almost like these diamond-like, almost teardrop-like forms. And adding a little bit more structure there. All right, so as we come across, I'm kind of working my way from the background forward. I'm going to start to create some of these forms along in here. And now to help orient myself, I'm looking for these dark edges that form the river bank. And I'm going to try to drop them in. So using the side of the pencil again. Now the tendency may be to pick up, use the point of the pencil, but I want to make sure that these read as thin shadows, not lines. So as I'm doing this, I'm trying to be mindful of the shape, but also where I'm at in the drawing. So I'm doing a quick check-in with this landmark, with some of the other features in the mountains, just to make sure I'm in the right spot. And I'm trying to be mindful of the angle here. It's at a very slight angle. It's more horizontal than it feels. And again, this is where I see a lot of issues with landscape painting of rivers, because there's a tendency to draw them as slanted when they're not. And so I'm just kind of be checking in with that. I'm just looking at those dark kind of shaded areas in the river banks, and I want to look for this curve in here. And if you're new, I want to make sure that you feel comfortable asking any questions, pointing out observations that are constructive. That's kind of part of why we're here drawing together, is to be able to share our observations. It's really helped pull me through some troubled drawings that have been ready to fall apart. So if something is happening in this drawing, for example, if the scale is off, or it feels like that river is slanting, then it's helpful to call that out. I think it's part of the feedback loop that is so helpful in art. Okay, so here again, now we have these variations in the hillside that are tricky to really understand. So I'm going to do my best. What I do know is that this side is more vertical. Then we have this kind of saddle formation that cuts in on top. So I'm going to use my eraser to do that. And that helps to create some differentiation. But I want to run my marks vertically here. Even though it's a very subtle area, it can go a long way in terms of creating the depth that we need. So when I'm using the eraser, I'm trying to be mindful of the pressure. And so there is a certain amount of smudging that's happening with the eraser. And then as I apply more pressure, it starts to kind of lift off a bit more. But I'll often use the eraser as a shading tool. As it picks up some of the graphite, or if I'm working with charcoal, it'll load the eraser, and it can be a very effective shading tool. So just be mindful of the pressure and see how that might help you. Krisha is asking, how many hours do I spend drawing? So we meet 2 days a week here at 1 p.m. Eastern, every Monday, Wednesday, and I do a preparatory drawing of that. So if we spend probably 10 hours a week or so drawing, and then I try to get out painting every week as well. And I spend a few hours on a painting each weekend. And now the reason I started this is that drawing is a skill that I had long neglected, and I felt like with this opportunity for us all to get together, you know, maybe we can be here for each other to just kind of hold ourselves accountable to drawing. And I found that it's been really helpful in my painting. You know, the issues inherent in drawing can sometimes be overlooked in painting as we get absorbed by color and the brushwork, things like that. And so, you know, it's by practicing here, it starts to become more second nature, and you think less about each of the specific things we do in a drawing. So you get at correct proportion and perspective, and composition more easily when painting as you practice drawing. So I think it's really helpful. Now, as I'm looking at some of these dark spots here, we can see where the shadows are. Again, I want to be mindful of the edges. There are areas where it's a sharper edge, like right up in here, and then it becomes more diffused. And that's really kind of important. It's a small part of the landscape, but paying attention to those edges is what's going to allow those dark spots to read as shadows and hold it onto the landscape. It's going to feel more naturalistic. Our brain is going to accept that as a natural formation if we pay attention to those edges. So take some time to really observe those in your own work and see how that's playing out. You know, where are some of those minor forms more visible? Where are they? Where are they sharper? Where are they more diffused? Okay. Yeah, Sally's saying, I love smudging to see where I need to apply more graphite. That is well stated. That is exactly how I feel. You know, throughout this whole series, you'll see me do that, laying it down, wiping it, laying more down, wiping it. And I'm doing less of that in this drawing, but it's generally, it's a really key part of the process is smudging and then building things out of that, building it out of the form. As my painting teachers would talk about early on, as they say, go into the mud and then pull it back out. That's where you get to some really specific colors and forms and marks, is when you allow it to feel like it's teetering on the edge of just falling apart. We talk about the ugly duckling stage in this series as well, is that every drawing seems to go through that. And that's one of my favorite aspects of drawing, is when you're working on something and you feel like it's just all going to crumble apart, and then you keep going and it pulls together. And smudging is kind of part of that process. So you lay down something nice and you smudge it out, you build it out again and smudge it out. Okay. Alicia, welcome. You're an hour late, but you're fine. This goes up as a recording. So as I'm working my way down this hillside, again, I'm looking for these shapes of the light and dark. The key thing that I'm holding in my mind, though, is the structure of the landscape. What is the angle? What is the curve? What is the directionality of some of these darker areas? And allowing myself to follow along that. You know, if you get the structure right in a landscape, man, that goes a long way. Allowing the brain to fill in some of the missing things. So this is where the texture starts to take over. We see some of that tundra area kind of becoming more visible. I'm going to soften it, smudge it out a little bit more back in this area. As I come across here, I'm just going to lightly scrape across the surface. You can see this two-tone variation in the tundra here. And I can go right over the edge of this river here because it's darker. And again, I mentioned at the top of the video, the landing page for this episode is posted. So if you want to share your work as soon as this drawing is done, you should be able to do so at artistnetwork.com. You'll see the link or the URL in the description. Now, YouTube blocks links to external sites, so it's not actually a link. But if you can copy and paste that into your browser. That's true with the the reference photo as well. All right, so I want to be mindful of the values here. So one of the things I talked about, and if you're late, then one of the things we talked about is creating a general value structure where we have light in the background, dark in the foreground, and if you squint at the reference photo, you can see how dark this is. And if it's harder to see that, put your awareness on the light just outside of the reference photo. I wonder if I can use my pencil to kind of point to it, but right along in here, you can see that contrast right up along the edge, how dark that photo actually is. So you can go pretty dark in this area, and that's what's going to help to pull that forward, and then we're going to increase the contrast by going even darker in some of those dark areas. So then this area here, these lines here that read as black, will actually be quite a bit lighter than the marks that we make down in here. So I can start to be mindful again of the structure of the landscape. You can see just using the side of the pencil, I'm allowing the tooth of the paper to show through, and that naturally is suggesting that texture of that tundra. Letting that do the work for me. That's when drawing gets really exciting. Drawing, painting, it's all about a relationship between the artist and the materials. And I love it when we can see that the materials themselves play an active role in the drawing or the painting. So I'm running these marks horizontally because that reflects the structure of the landscape. And look at that. It's already starting to suggest that tundra. I'm going to bring that river through there in a bit. So Relisha's asking, how did I get these, I'm assuming some of these streaks here. So if you play back the video, you'll see we kind of started by building up a layer of kind of atmosphere. And then as you get to those areas, then it's really just a matter of using your white chalk and bearing down a little bit more, but using the side of the pencil, not the tip, to create those forms. Again, I just find that when I'm using the tip of the material, like in a tripod grip like this, it creates marks that the brain recognizes as lines, as kind of contour edges, and that pulls me out of the drawing. It's less likely to be interpreted as texture in the landscape. So I'm building up those values there, and it's already starting to create some depth. All right. Smudge that out a little bit, still creating some of that tooth, but it softens it a little bit because I'm going to come back in and I can create more texture on top. So now as I'm working my way across this tundra, I'm looking for any sort of subtle indications of the structure of the land. So I'm keeping this generally horizontally aligned, and I'm just moving down and then trying to kind of roll the pencil, pressure, apply some pressure where I think some of these darker marks are going to be. Okay, so right here, there's a little dark mark where that tundra kind of spills over into the water. I think I need to do is I need to create some contrast in the water there. So I'm going to use the shading stump to actually draw the river. So I'm looking for that S-curve, and so one of the things you want to be careful of is you want to look at these bends, and those are kind of landmarks. It's almost like creating a connect the dots. But you want to be thinking constantly back and forth across the river to find those landmarks. That's what's going to keep this thing horizontal and on the ground plane. As I'm looking at some of these key features here, if they're out of alignment, then it's gonna make the river feel more slanted, if that makes sense. Here we come to the river bend here. Doing some quick check-ins to make sure I'm oriented properly relative to other landmarks. So I see some of these dark spots. You can see some of the shadows on either side of the bank. And that's what I'm doing, is I'm trying to be mindful of these two marks here. And as I draw this in, I'm looking at these marks here to see if I'm in the right spot. So again, so much of drawing is about working on one area while your awareness is on another. So I'm bouncing around, and I'm trying to hold all of that in my mind, not at once, but jumping back and forth quickly between those. And then down in here, we get a really nice contrast between a lighter hill here, or like tundra here, darker river. I might even drop the value in the river just a little bit more. And look for this edge along in here. Do an angle sighting here. So I'm closing one eye, aligning my pencil with this angle of the river here. Kind of carry it over to the drawing so I can play that out, start to visualize that path. That's going to help anchor it to the ground. If I bring this down, it's going to change the slope of the landscape. If I bring it up, it's going to change it. So getting that right is important. And it doesn't take a whole lot of time, but doing some of that angle sighting can help to kind of put that in check. And we have these kind of grassy mounds here. So it's a combination of a horizontal and a vertical mark here to create those kind of moving horizontally, but using these vertical marks to suggest those grasses. And there's that thin line along this edge here. And then right along in here, this is really tricky. Looking for the alternating sequence of light and dark. So if I'm looking at the relationship between the value of the water and the value of the landscape, it's darker here, lighter here. Now I didn't make this lighter, I made this darker. Now as I move across, there are sections where those hilly mounds are darker again than the water. And then there's a stretch where it's lighter than the water. So I'm kind of working both the grass and the water at the same time. And as I come across here, it gets really tricky. They become really equivalent, but then there are these mounds that kind of stick up in the water. So without lightening up any area, I'm going to go in and I'm going to place the darks. So these short kind of vertical squiggles as I move horizontally. I want to be mindful of the horizontal orientation of the water so that these feel like they're sitting properly in that landscape. And maybe smooth this out a little bit here. So hopefully that makes sense. That felt like that took a bit more concentration. All right, so here, now I see there's this general path where it smooths out over here. So I'm going to look for some of the shape of the shadows. Again, using the side of the pencil to create these more naturalistic looking forms, bearing down pretty heavily. Just looking for the shape of the dark forms and kind of trusting that it's going to read as those tundra kind of mounds. I remember, I lived up in Alaska for years in graduate school and went hiking up in the Brooks Range, very similar. I don't know if this is the Brooks Range, but it looks very similar to that. And just walking around landscapes just like this without any trees, more mosquitoes than is imaginable. But, just taking forever to get through areas like this. Okay, so and then there's some of these some of these that kind of stick out here as well. So as we see these variations in value here, I'm not going any lighter. I've laid down quite a bit of value on this already, but rather than go lighter here, I'm going to go darker everywhere else, and I think that's going to create more depth. And so in order for me to go darker, that's where I'm going to pull out this pencil here. This is that Creatacolor Nero. So now let's see what happens. I'm evaluating the smaller screen here in front of me, so it's like stepping back. So if you can, set this up at a distance and step back, walk up to it and see how it holds together. What stands out for you? Does it create the depth that you want? At looking at it from a distance, does it look flat? Can you see everything? It should read at a relatively great distance. Right now, it looks pretty flat to me because I have darks here that are equivalent to the darks here. And I'm going to push that by now using this Creatacolor, this darker. There goes that sharp point. Oh well. And creating that contrast. So you can see the difference in values there. And that's what's really going to make this thing come to life. And I'm not going to do that everywhere. I'm just looking for the areas where it's the darkest dark. And that starts to bring life into that. And then I'm going to switch. I'm going to leave these values back here as I'm looking at those river banks there. I feel like that reads pretty well at that distance, and I want to bring this stuff forward now. So you can see that I'm making those lines. It's just these quick, jagged little marks. I can start to add a little bit more detail here. I think I might need to kind of clarify this edge a little bit, but I'm going to come back for that. Mary is saying, you've been working on acrylics, huh? Trying to create that mist. Acrylics can be a little bit challenging. I worked in acrylics for quite a while working in landscapes, and I switched back to oils just because the quick drying time wasn't working for me. It's difficult to create those atmospheric effects in acrylics, I feel, so just, it takes some additional practice. Actually going to apply this to some of the river there, looking for that edge, because I feel like this is a bit more clear along here. So now I'm actually drawing in the river part. And here I can go back on, again, darker on top of that value. So I'm just trying to evaluate that constant, ever-changing relationship between light and dark throughout the landscape. So even in this really thin line, I want to make sure it's not just a line, but there's some kind of texture to it, breaking it up. It'll read more naturalistically as a shadow. And that's working now. That's creating a bit more depth. It's still getting darker as a whole, but it's like we're just like piano keys. We're dropping the octaves as we come down. So the intervals between the values is generally consistent, but we're changing the set point. I didn't really get this right. I wasn't really observing the shape of light and dark here, but that's all right. I think I'm kind of suggesting it effectively enough. And again, just with every other drawing, you want to define for yourself what your tolerance is for inaccuracy. Do you want to capture the overall essence of the space? Does it have to be 100% photographic duplication of the reference photo? There's no right or wrong, it's just what works for you, what aligns with your own sensibilities. All right, I want to add a little bit more structure here. So rather than lightening up this side, I'm darkening the water, kind of doing some negative drawing. And then I need more structure here, looking for those areas where there's some dark. Again, just using the tooth of the paper as much as possible to create that texture. I feel like it's better to have something that simulates the texture, even if I'm not getting it 100% accurately. Just kind of react to the landscape, drop it down where you need to, where you see darker marks. Being mindful of this horizontal orientation of the landscape. There we go. I'm trying to visualize what's happening here. Okay. Alicia is asking, basic drawing, basic good quality drawing supplies, any suggestions? You know, it's hard. I mean, I think a lot of the companies, when you get to the point where you're working with kind of professional grade materials, you're going to get some good materials. So Prismacolor, you know, Generals, Staedtler makes good drawing materials. I think, you know, play around with different papers, see what works for you as well. The paper is something that's really kind of the unsung hero in many ways. We often don't pay as much attention to the paper as we should. Oh, there's some nice texture right in here. But, you know, play around. You know, there's Canson and there's Strathmore, Arches. You know, there's lots of different brands. Play around with, you know, ones that are made for charcoal, ones that are made for mixed media, you know, Bristol board versus vellum, things like that, and try to get your hands on as much of it as you can to see how it all works and what aligns with your sensibility as an artist and what, you know, how you use the materials. It is a relationship between the materials and the artist, and you find the materials that really connect and resonate with you. But in general, like when you get to kind of professional grade supplies, you're going to get good materials. I know Lyra makes some really good drawing materials as well, and I know artists that really swear by them. It's not something I've spent a whole lot of time worrying about. Like for me, you know, I think my biggest fear is that somebody would say, "Oh, I can't draw because I don't have the right materials." So I don't think that's necessarily what you're saying here, but I think for anybody listening, you know, you can, if you had just a regular yellow number 2 school pencil, you're good to go. You can draw. You can get something that works. It's something that's valuable to you. All right. How do I feel? I feel like that works out pretty well. Looking at the structure, now there's a greater differentiation between the foreground, middle ground, and background. The foreground and middle ground aren't kind of washed out. What I want to do now is add some of that texture, the white caps in the water, that I think really help to differentiate that. So the first thing I'm going to do, actually, let me grab, this is a General's pastel chalk. Just going to drop it on there and see what happens, see if it actually works. It's not doing a whole lot. I'm working that background. And I'm going to apply it here. It looks like that floated on top nicely. Now as I go through, though, I'm going to evaluate and see what happens. Is if it, like right here, just slipping on that layer of graphite. If I get it wet, tip it to my tongue. That can sometimes help. but I like to think about it scraping across the surface on top of that as much as possible. Let's see if that didn't do much of anything. So if I need to, what I may end up having to do is erase off. So I'm really bearing down there. It didn't do a whole lot. I'm going to come across here. I'm rolling the pencil in my fingers, and that seems to actually be making a mark. I haven't needed to erase. In the preparatory one that I did, I had to erase out some of the material and then lay this chalk on top. But if I'm finding that if I'm just rolling the pencil, it actually is working well for me. And I'm being mindful of the angles. I'm evaluating to see what it's doing to the surface plane of the water, because I don't want it to tilt at all. So far it seems to be working out okay. And it's really not grabbing right there. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my plastic eraser, kind of find the path that I want to drop that white pastel onto, clean that off, and then see how this works now. There, it's actually taking now. And break up that line so it's not an even, kind of consistent line. And right in here, there's a little bit of white that kind of catches in this corner. No, that didn't work. I need to erase more. All right. I think that did it. How's everybody feeling? I'm glad that Liz, thanks for that comment. And Arkham, you're asking, how do you shade and draw from perspective? That's a lot to answer right there. I think if you're new to the series, I'd say go back to some of the earlier drawings. And so on our YouTube page, we have them numbered by episodes. The egg is a really good one in terms of drawing and shading. And I've done some more recent buildings that incorporate some perspective, so you might find that more helpful. There's a lot to kind of dig into there for shading and perspective. This is really more about that atmospheric perspective and controlling values. Using that toned paper, you can see that we've got that, just the bare paper right in here against that white chalk. And as we come down here, increasing that value range, and as we look, we're shifting the values down, we're keying everything down so this gets darker, and those lights, it's reading as lighter because we have a strong interval change between these two values, but this is actually darker than these areas here. And that's what we're going for. Value is something that's really kind of tricky, and it's easy for illusions to be played on us, and seeing values in a particular way when they're actually not. Over here, that's what I meant to go back in. I feel like I need a little bit of these snow, little snow mounds left in that shaded area. And drop those in. Do I feel like there's enough detail in here? I feel like that's working out pretty well. This feels a little generic, so I want to just double check to make sure I have enough structure over here. Heather, you're saying you lost some of your depth there. Generally, that's going to be a value issue, value contrast. So just check to make sure that when we're up in here, your darkest value is barely darker than the paper itself, the tone paper. This isn't a middle gray. This is, if we have a value scale of 0 being white, 10 being black, this is probably a 3. Still fairly light, but closer to the middle, maybe a 4. So in this top section, your value range should be between 0 white and maybe a 4. And then as we come down here, the lights are starting at a 4 here, and then maybe a 6 in the darks. Coming down here, the light area is really more of a 6 or a 7, and the darks are the 10. And so you can see how that, just like, you know, octaves on a piano, we're kind of shifting things down. So the relationship between light and dark here, maybe there's an interval change of 3 or so value steps, but we're much darker on that scale. So hopefully that makes sense. There's a question here: how can I make clean and sharp lines in your drawing? That's a good question. I don't worry about protecting my hands or protecting the drawings. But generally, if you think about the structure of your drawing and know that it's going to make a mess, that's the process that I use. I generally make a mess and make soft marks, gradually make them sharper. You know, so the area where it's sharpest here starts as a general shape, and as if I have a sharp edge, what I can do is kind of work my way from here up to that edge to find it, rather than drawing the edge and then shading up around it. So kind of start from the inside of the form and work your way out to the edge. That can sometimes make a sharper edge for you. But I think controlling that is really important. You know, having a nice variety of edges is going to be important. So if I made some of these edges here too sharp, it would actually pull that forward too much. If you follow along any of the edges, it's always changing, and that's what's creating that naturalistic look. It's making it look more realistic. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, I think that's it. You know, we're working with another portrait on Wednesday, drawing a child's features. We had an older man last Wednesday, and now we're going to switch gears and go try to capture the quality of features of a child. Now Wednesday is going to be a bit tricky. I actually have jury duty on Wednesday, so so I'm going to be working on a recording. So if I can't make it for the live event, a recording will be up, but I'm going to do my best to be back in time to do the live event. So we're just kind of on a waiting. It's like a waiting game right now. I want to see what shakes out for me. So I'm actually looking forward to it, doing my civic duty. But just so you know, there will be something on Wednesday. We're going to post it at the same time. Hopefully it'll be live. If not, it'll be a recording. And we're going to have links to the landing pages. So again, if you're joining us, check out artistnetwork.com. You'll find the URL in the description below where you can go to the landing page for this. You'll find the video that will go up there shortly, and as well as the discussion thread where you can share all your work. So it's awesome seeing everybody's work. A lot was posted over the weekend, so I'm really excited to dig through that again. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to hang out just for a few seconds to see if in the lag any questions come through, because it always happens. A great question comes in right after I've ended the live stream, so I'll do what I can. But again, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Oh, Bob A, I see that comment. That's fun. That's interesting. All right, thank you everybody. Looks like we're good to go. So I'm going to sign off now. Have a great couple days. See you in a couple days.